Okay, hi everybody. I'm Jonathan Zeichman. I'm the Academic Director of the Amsterdam Center for European Studies, ACES, which is sponsoring today's lecture. I'm really delighted to welcome back to Amsterdam, at least virtually, I mean, in reality, physical presence, but virtually for the rest of you, Brigid Laffan. Brigid is the Emeritus Director of the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies at the European University Institute in Florence. She holds many honors. She taught for many years also at University College Dublin, and where she was also Vice Provost, is that correct? President, excuse me. Let me just mention a few honors. She was ranked in 2018 among the women who shaped Europe by Politico. She's been awarded the Ordre National du Mérite by the President of the French Republic, the Theseus Award for Outstanding Research on European Integration, and the UASIS Lifetime Achievement Award. But beyond these awards, she's really made very important contributions to the study of Europe and the EU in many areas. Probably maybe best known as a specialist on the arcana of the budgetary process within the EU. She has just finished directing a huge Horizon 2020 project called Integrating Diversity in the EU, which I had the privilege of participating in myself. And that project also has a kind of afterlife in a network on differentiated integration, clustering, excellence, which brings together IndiVU scholars and two other Horizon 2020 projects that have just finished on differentiated integration. Now, she's going to talk to us today about the EU's response to Brexit. This is part of, I would say, a bigger project in two dimensions. One, a book, I think, on Brexit, or on Brexit and the EU, but also a broader rethinking of the EU as a collective power. And some of you may be aware that she's given another lecture, the annual Usher Institute lecture in The Hague about that. And that, of course, has a geopolitical as well as an internal and political dimension. So I'm going to turn it over now to Brigid. Brigid will talk for about 40 minutes. Then we will have an opportunity for Q&A. You can post your questions in the Q&A, but also in the chat. I think it will be simplest if you do it in the Q&A. And I think that it will be possible for us actually to recognize you and let you speak. At least we're trying to do that. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Brigid. We're looking forward to hearing what you have to tell us.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a wonderful pleasure to be back in Amsterdam on a sunny day. As someone said to me, mind bicycles. So I was reminded of where I was. I wonder, could you help me just share the screen, please? Okay, so I want to talk this evening about Brexit, and arguably Brexit is old news. If you remember back to June 2016, the 23rd, 24th of June, there was this extraordinary sense that something very dramatic had happened, something very big in the life and history of the EU. But of course, since then we've had pandemics, several waves, and we've also now had war return to the continent. So in some sense, Brexit seems very tame and very old news. But one of the arguments I want to make in work that I'm now doing is firstly that we do need to understand how the EU responded to Brexit. A lot of work has been done on the UK dimension of Brexit, but not so much on the EU and how it handled Brexit. But also, I think that Brexit was the start of quite an important shift in the EU, and that is what I am calling collective power Europe. And it's a shift that really signals a stronger sense of robustness and resilience in the system. And I think that that resilience has been shown through the pandemic and now also is being shown with Ukraine. So I think that the Brexit case remains important. We need to understand it. We need to know how it was that the EU responded with such speed, remained united, and in my view was very effective. But of course, we have to think of the context of Brexit. Brexit came after a series of crises. The EU had experienced a lot of turbulence up to 2016, and also you had the renegotiation of the United Kingdom with the EU, as the EU, in my view, did everything it could to hold the UK as a member state, and it failed. So the key argument I want to make is that the EU 27 responded rapidly, in a united way and in an effective way. And it did so because it drew on its collective capacity as a political system, or as I say here, a polity. How did it do that? Firstly, it framed Brexit. Secondly, it mobilized its resources. And thirdly, it defended its interests. I'm going to do less on preferences and interests this evening and more on framing and mobilizing resources because of that collective capacity. But just a reminder of the reactions to Brexit. Well, you had Nigel Farage absolutely delighted that he had finally achieved his goal of getting the United Kingdom out. You have a rather sheepish Boris Johnson looking down, wondering what he had actually done, but of course it did deliver to him what his prime objective was, and that was to become Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And then we see David Cameron to the right, and I remember saying to someone before in the week leading up, because I thought it was going to be that no Leave would win. And I remember saying to someone, how long could Cameron last if the UK voted for Brexit? And I was told he'd be toast by 8 o'clock the next morning, and toast he was. But how did scholars react to Brexit? And here I think this is really interesting, that the initial response from scholars was that this was very dangerous and very serious to the EU. So Ben Rosmond, what Brexit might mean to both the UK and the EU has very quickly become the defining question of contemporary European politics. Well, it wasn't. Or even Preston saying disintegration, if that was considered unthinkable, now it's inevitable. And Matthews, the United Kingdom vote to leave the European Union triggered the worst political crisis the EU has ever faced. So again,
you're seeing your screen, not what's up there. And someone has just asked if we could move the slide.
Well, I don't know why that's the case.
I have no idea.
So
maybe it's on presenter view.
Maybe you just put it all to presenter, because otherwise this is not going to. And I just take my note of my, because it's very irritating if you. Yeah, are you now seeing the whole thing?
Yes, now it's perfect.
Yeah, okay, well, the downside is I don't get to see my next slide, but that's okay. I should probably broadly remember. But I think it's interesting that academics...
It's now translated into Dutch.
that academics rushed to judgment on Brexit and, in a sense, catastrophized it. that it would lead to disintegration, that it was the defining question, and that it was the worst political crisis the EU had ever faced. Well, we now know that's not the case. And one of the reasons why it's not the case is that the EU responded. And it responded firstly with speed. The EU, by the next morning, Tusk had made a statement. In the afternoon, all of the supranational actors, including the then Dutch presidency, had come out. And of course, the EU spoke with one voice. And the EU, in my view, was very effective at defending its interests. Now, when we think about the existing approaches in the literature to how to theorize and analyze the EU's response, well, liberal intergovernmentalism gives us a good theory of preferences and bargaining, but it doesn't give us a good handle on non-economic interests and on the role of institutions, but also economic interests did not dominate the EU's response to Brexit. They were important, but they didn't drive the response. Post-functionalism gives us a lens on non-economic interests, clearly helps us explain the Brexit vote, all of the identity issues, the take back control, but it doesn't tell us anything about how the EU remained united. And I would argue supranationalism stroke neo-functionalism, with the emphasis only on supranational institutions, in my view, neglects the importance of the whole and the parts, because it wasn't just the supranational institutions that drove the response to Brexit. It was really very much also the member states and the capitals. And in fact, it was that combination of the whole and the parts that made the EU so effective during this crisis. So Brexit, in my view, compelled the EU to draw on its strengths and capacity. And when I say capacity in relation to the EU, I'm not talking of what one would call classical state capacity, but rather on the capacity that a highly distinctive prismatic polity can draw on. And it did draw on its resources and on its identity. It also drew very much on its market power and as a producer of European public goods. And Brexit compelled the EU to use its power, but that form of power, the power to get things done, and I would argue that that is power to rather than power over, that that's the nature of the power that we were witnessing predominantly in this. So my argument in a nutshell, so the analytical framework that we're using in the book we're doing is that Brexit began as an endogenous shock. It was a member state leaving. It demanded an EU response, and that the EU's power too was evident in its power to frame Brexit, its power to create institutional process, knowledge and capacity, its power to determine its collective interests, to mold the interests of the member states in a collective way. And then it used power over in the second phase, in the negotiations with the United Kingdom in phases 1 and 2, the withdrawal agreement and the agreement on the future relationship. And the EU has not always been comfortable at using its power. It has, as we know as an international actor, has been much stronger on the rhetorical than it is necessarily on the actually doing things, stronger on verbal commitments and weaker on getting things done. But this is where I argue there was a shift in the EU in this period as the EU instinctively, and it was very reflex, responded to Brexit. So back to so the argument I want to make in a nutshell is the framing was that this was an external shock, a systemic shock, and a symmetric shock, which helped unity, and that there was intensive institutional coordination and resource mobilization and joint methods that allowed for or led to the effectiveness. So back, I'm looking at my notes, and I'm looking at my overheads, but I've obviously taken out a lot because I'm hopping over them. But let's go back to the framing, or begin with the framing, because the EU had to frame what Brexit meant. And obviously, as we know from the literature, there are very significant political stakes in problem definition. That's core to kingdom. And frames are powerful nudges that affect the choices that are made and the architecture of choice that is involved. And the EU leaders did not have a long time to understand and interpret what Brexit meant. They really had to come out very quickly and say, from their perspective, what did Brexit mean? And there was a preparatory phase before the 23rd of June. Both Juncker's cabinet, and Juncker himself, and Tusk and his cabinet were concerned that there might be a leave vote. And particularly Juncker was convinced there would be. And so there was a preparatory phase as the two institutions discussed, well, what are the lines to take if this happens? What do we do? We need to get out there very quickly. So on the morning of the 24th, you had an immediate response, and within 1 week, you had a European Council of the 27. And there was some debate among the member states, could they meet on the 27? Obviously, Article 50 allows that, but Article 50 was not in operation. So they really did just grasp the nettle of the leave vote and decide to do something about it. So what were the different elements of the frame? The first was purely unity. We're determined to keep our unity at 27. We are united in our response. The President's statement in the afternoon, and the European Council 1 week later, we are determined to remain united. So there was a very strong rhetorical commitment to the unity of the 27. We will respond to this crisis / challenge together. Now, at this stage, it was simply rhetorical, and the EU had to then translate that into a practice norm. And if you look at responses for the years and years and years of the Brexit negotiations, there was always the question, when would the unity break? When would this not survive the internal dynamics of the EU and the divide and conquer strategy of the United Kingdom? The second element was the polity element, and that was a commitment to the EU and to its future. It's the common future, it will continue, and it is our framework to deal with the challenges of the 21st century. So, in other words, we're losing a large member state. This is a loss, lose-lose. We don't want this to happen. But if it has happened and will happen, then the EU will survive this. In other words, the polity is not going to disintegrate because the United Kingdom has decided to leave. So unity and commitment to the Union. And then what I think was, in a sense, from a UK perspective, a framing that was very problematic for it. And that was that the EU transformed the UK from a member state of the EU into a third country in waiting. In other words, the UK was no longer a member state a la 27. It had opted to leave, it would leave, and therefore the EU transformed by this framing as the UK as a third country in waiting, transformed an endogenous shock, which could have led to very serious questioning of the EU, into an exogenous one. In other words, this is not about the EU, it's about the UK. And even though that actually was politically difficult to sustain, because clearly the EU had challenges and problems, but it meant that the UK was the focus of Brexit all the time, and the EU and how it would handle it, but it wasn't systemic to the EU. And for me, what that illustrates and reveals is that the United Kingdom was not an essential EU member state. It was not essential to the system in the end of the day. And of course, because of all of its opt-outs, it was much easier to lose the UK than it would have been lose, for example, a Euro state, a Euro member state. And then process, Article 50. We have train tracks. The train track to exit the EU is you get on the Article 50 station, you get on the train and you leave. And all the procedures for withdrawal are, according to Tusk, clear and set out in the treaties. The EU was very concerned in this initial phase that the United Kingdom would somehow or other not use Article 50 and just leave. So the EU wanted an orderly withdrawal and it wanted the rules to be used. And the legal basis for this was Article 50, Article 50, Article 50. But the EU added to the treaty another process element that was very significant in the conduct of those negotiations. And that was what was called the NNWN mantra, and that was no negotiation without notification, no pre-negotiation, no attempt to work through with the United Kingdom what might be available and most international negotiations have a pre-negotiation phase. But the United Kingdom was told, we will not talk to you about anything until you notify. And that was taken as a practice norm, both by the institutions in Brussels, but also the capitals. They did speak to the UK, there was bilateral engagement, but anything that smacked of the negotiations to leave, those were simply not in the UK was not engaged with. And just to give you, this is some document analysis we did on the Brexit documents, and it shows that references to unity, integrity of the single market, UK as a third country, integrity of the four freedoms were the dominant, references that were coming through. So that frame was really to highlight the unity frame, was to highlight the systemic impact of Brexit on the EU as a polity rather than the asymmetric economic impact on different member states. It was all about the union and the survival of the union, and central to that was the integrity of the single market. And in the first European Council conclusions of 27, on Merkel's insistence, the four freedoms, that the integrity of the single market implied all four freedoms was strengthened. And then that third country frame that I've already referred to, that Brexit is homegrown in the United Kingdom, it's a UK choice. We're really sad you're leaving, we respect your decision, but this is your call. Now, what critical function did framing play in the EU response to Brexit? Firstly, it helped and assisted the coordination of the actors both at EU level and at domestic. The multi-level polity was glued together for the negotiations. And of course, it was a very important exercise in communication. It aided communication within and across the institutions, within the member states, and vis-a-vis London. And there was nothing accidental about EU communications on Brexit. There was a consistent management of so-called lines to take. There was message consistency and coherence. And I actually had a demonstration of the lines to take one time because I happened to be interviewing in the task force, the commission task force, one day when that evening there was going to be a vote in the House of Commons, and it was anticipated it would go down. And I was told what was going to be said that evening. And 5 minutes after the vote came in, that's precisely what was said. So the lines to take were coordinated across the institutions, but also with all the capitals. Now, framing, of course, is only one part of the story of the capacity of the power tool. The second thing, I just need to go back because I'm obviously jumping ahead. So I've already said that unity was translated into a practice norm and the intensity of the vertical and horizontal cooperation. That's all done. Framing of the UK as a third country, all done. Now, the second was the mobilization of resources. And that was, what was really important here was the creation of an institutional ecology dedicated to Brexit. In other words, there were task institutions created, special institutions created within EU policy making. That began in June 16. The Council Secretariat created the Council Special Task Force on Brexit, led by Lydia Siglis, who was from Rompuy, chef de cabinet. He understood the European Council. He was a very practiced lawyer and a very practiced manager of council business. Then in July, Juncker appoints Michel Barnier as the chief negotiator and as head of a task force that was prepared in the lead up to October 16 and began work in October 16. And then by April 17 in the European Parliament, the Conference of Presidents set up the Brexit steering group under Guy Verhofstadt with 5 others. So there was a dedicated institutional ecology, and that served a lot of different purposes for the EU. Firstly, it insulated day-to-day EU policy making and legislation from Brexit. And in one of the interviews we've done, that's been described as ensuring that no Brexit pollution damages the EU. In other words, Brexit is to be handled separately from everything else, because of course, UK ministers and civil servants were still attending council working parties and council ministers' meetings. The second thing it did was it allowed for the creation of very intensive interinstitutional processes, and those interinstitutional processes were very collaborative. As the council was developing the guidelines on the withdrawal agreement, people from the task force were there, from the commission task force were there, although of course the document was always in the hands of the council. And then this allowed a mobilization of the resources right across EU institutions, and also could draw on member states, the stakeholders, and the citizens. So that institutional ecology, that special dedicated task force approach, was quite innovative in the history of EU institutions, and worked extremely well from the point of view of the EU. I'd say made negotiations for the UK much, much tougher, but it did allow for that mobilization. And then, of course, the Commission. So what was the role of the Commission in all of this? I would say that the Commission was the knowledge institution within the EU on Brexit. It was the part of the ecology that had the deepest and broadest knowledge. And by creating a task force within, you could A, get the synergies across all areas, but also they could draw on the directorates general. And Barnier would meet the DGs every 2 weeks. He also obviously spoke to the college with great frequency. So again, the commission was a well-oiled machine when it comes to Brexit. And the first thing they did was that they reviewed 35 chapters of the acquis to Brexit-proof them. And that meant that they had a series of documents that allowed them to understand the consequence of Brexit right across the range. But then they needed to get buy-in from the key stakeholders, and here I'm talking about the other institutions, but also the member states. There was a strong educational element in what the Commission did in this period. It needed to get the member states on board with all of the technical details. Someone said to me, we rediscovered the customs union. And so they had a series of seminars that involved Parliament, Council, and member states, and in all areas that were going to come up in the negotiations. And so what this was an effort at ensuring that differences across the member states would be ironed out, that there would be, again, that emphasis on the collective. And Barnier, by January 17, had visited all of the capitals. So again, he played a very important role in ensuring that the member states felt comfortable with what the EU was doing. And transparency. Barnier felt from the beginning that unless there was transparency in what the EU was doing, then there would be leaks. And of course, leaks would lead to mistrust in the capitals and a sense that some capitals knew more than others. So the Barnier method was we say everything every day to everybody. Now, of course, in negotiations, for example, at the end of the withdrawal agreement, there was a tunnel, but most of the time, everyone was kept on board. And even when the withdrawal agreement was, the first withdrawal agreement was agreed, the Commission committed to the member states to answering all of their questions on it within a certain time frame. And they did. And the questions were, I can't remember the number now, but there were very, very, very many questions. So another feature of the EU's approach and response was to use procedure and process strategically. So what did they do? They, firstly, I think it's worth anyone's time revisiting the first guidelines on the withdrawal agreement that came from the Council task force. They are very finely written in terms of covering all the bases. And the EU then decided that it needed to build into this staging posts. In other words, it understood the politics of time in relation to Brexit and phasing. And they used in the first withdrawal negotiation, the first phase, that there had to be sufficient progress made on the key issues before the EU would move on to the future relationship to a political declaration. In other words, making sure all the time that the time pressure was on the United Kingdom. And the EU was prepared at any stage, in my view. It never wanted no deal, but there were circumstances in which they would accept no deal rather than concede on key issues. So in a sense, they knew what the background was, that they didn't want no deal, they would do everything to avoid no deal, but they would not move on the key red lines. So then moving on to the interests. Obviously, 27 member states, very asymmetric impact of Brexit on those member states, much greater impact on countries like Ireland and the Netherlands and the northern countries, much less for the Central Europeans, predominantly about free movement. And for the Mediterranean, yes, there were real interests, and of course for Spain there was Gibraltar. But there was a very asymmetric economic impact, but all that had to be molded into a collective response. Now, at the outset, one could have argued that the UK as one state would have an overwhelming advantage in determining its economic and non-economic preferences. It had a powerful central government and had a political mandate from the referendum. But of course, as it turns out, the UK did not know what Brexit meant. It could not achieve any consensus across the political parties and even within political parties. And it completely misread how the EU would determine its interests. And so the UK was faced with no negotiation, no pre-negotiation, no testing of the waters, and also then that domestic uncertainty about what Brexit meant. And again, one of the great puzzles of the UK response to Brexit is that Theresa May did not establish a parliamentary commission or did not buy time using the representative channel to balance the direct democracy channel. It was as if that because the people had spoken and this was not a referendum country, that they had to get Brexit done, and Brexit means Brexit. So again, I think there's quite a contrast between the way in which the UK responded to Brexit in a strategic sense and the EU. And it's very clear that when we looked at the documents on the withdrawal agreement in particular, that citizens were by far the most, the issue that loomed largest, then Ireland and the border, which is a surprise. And one would have expected money, finance, and budgets to rate higher in terms of the weight it was accorded. But Ireland and the border seem to outweigh it in consideration. Now, in terms of the structure of the negotiations, we had phase one, which took a very long time from the opening of negotiations June 17 to the UK's withdrawal. And we had two withdrawal agreements. We had the May Agreement and the Johnson Agreement. And this was political Brexit. But of course, because of transition, and the transition lasted until the 31st of December 2020, economic Brexit only began on the 1st of January 2021. Now, the outcome on the 1st, the dominant issues were the issues that came through all those negotiations. Firstly, citizens, the EU wanted to make sure, did not trust the UK in terms of particularly the Home Office, and wanted to make sure that those who had lives in the UK at the time would be properly treated. But of course, the UK also had an interest in citizens because there were an even larger number of UK citizens resident in the member states. On Ireland and the border, I'll say something about that in a minute. On the budget, this was a very real battle because the UK began saying, and there was a House of Lords report saying we own nothing. And then by the Florence speech, May conceded that no member state would be worse off as a consequence of the UK leaving, and that they would buy into certain principles in relation to the budget. And of course, the budget just goes on and on because there are liabilities there. In terms of phase 2, and that's the TCA, here we've ended up with the thinnest agreement that could have been envisaged at the start. It was market access was low, and the EU and UK do not have an agreement that is in any way representative of the nearness, the geographical nearness, and also the amount of trade and economic exchange. Fisheries, again, was the issue at the very end, but the EU was determined to get an outcome on fisheries. Level playing field, again, really very distinctive level playing field provisions, and it's not clear to me how they would work in practice, but certainly those that watch the relationship in the Commission and the Council are happy that they have. And also then the overarching governance, the UK wanted a set of different arrangements, and the EU was unwilling to concede on that. So in terms of the core EU red lines, they crossed none of them. They would have preferred a deeper and thicker relationship. They would have preferred references to the Court of Justice in the TCA, but it had to be international law, and the EU was prepared to go there, but not prepared to do so without provisions on the level playing field. And then just a word on Ireland. Why did Ireland become, and it still is, the neuralgic point in the relationship? And the reason is that this is a contested land border. And you see one of those roads in Northern Ireland, between Northern Ireland and the Republic. One side of the road is the United Kingdom and the other side is the EU. You also see that the British Army was very active on this border right up to 1997, and the withdrawal took slightly longer. And if you look at the vote, the Brexit vote in Northern Ireland, all the yellow voted Remain, and those are all the border counties. And those who voted in favour of leave are sufficiently detached from the border. So the people who live on that border would not consent to the reintroduction of a visible border, because it had been extremely disruptive of life, economic and cultural exchange, and this is the same society either. There's a nationalist majority in all border counties, so for them to be cut off from the Republic is not something that they will or would ever accept. So Brexit could never have been achieved without an accommodation from Ireland. But that accommodation is extremely vulnerable. It's, the United Kingdom is threatening to withdraw from elements of the Northern Ireland Protocol, because in the end what happened was the UK ended up with a GB sovereignty first Brexit, but not an all UK Brexit. So just to draw this to a conclusion. Firstly, the EU was determined to protect and preserve the gains of integration. And that wasn't just about economic interests, but about European public goods, borders, peace, a rules-based system. Secondly, it really revealed that membership has to matter. And that's not good for the other states, neighbours of the EU, because it puts a premium on membership. A small state leader would not have caused anything like the challenges posed by the United Kingdom, both the economic clout, etc. It also revealed the very deep distinction between internal and external differentiation, that opt-outs within the EU are very different to opting in from outside, and that the EU has had to carefully look at the balance between rights and obligations of members and non-members. And finally, the EU, I think Brexit, but also that collective power Europe that I observe since then, is that the EU is the central vehicle for transnational governance in this part of the world, and all European states have to reach an accommodation, however difficult that is, including the United Kingdom. Thank you.
Let me just try stopping sharing the screen.
Yeah, I'm unmuting myself. I don't think that's going to work.
I was hoping that because we're all focused on this laptop, maybe get rid of me. And actually, maybe the best thing is for you to say the opposite. Now we have questions.
So where do I sit?
So if you sit where I was sitting,
okay.
Okay. Good place. Sorry, we're feeling our way through doing these things hybridly. So thanks for a fantastic talk. I think that since we do have some, no, I don't see actual questions. They're just comments about the slides. So let me ask people who in the audience would like to put questions, to put them in the Q&A, and then I can read them out and have Brigid answer. Maybe, as always, I have plenty of questions of my own, but I want maybe Teresa Kuhn, who's here with us, has something that she would like to ask, or if you want me to go first, I can do that.
No, I'm fine. I mean, one question that I have been wondering, I mean, first of all, it's a super interesting talk. Thanks a lot for this. As you said in your introduction, Brexit now seems like a relatively small crisis to compare to the things that we have seen in the meantime. However, at that time, we really thought this would be the moment of disintegration, or the beginning of the end of the EU, so to speak. One question that has been coming back to me in the last couple of weeks, when I saw basically the EU's reaction to the Ukraine invasion, to what extent do you think that the experience of Brexit, and also here the necessity to come up with a joint and, as you say, a very unified response very quickly, and then also the experience of COVID-19, where the EU in the beginning was not so unified. But to what extent do you think these experiences have actually, you know, had a learning process for policymakers, so to actually get themselves organized much more quickly than what we usually expect them to do when we talk about the EU?
So I think we have, I would say that the response to Brexit was the beginning. Now, one has to be extremely careful when you talk about step change. But I think I would sustain an argument that Brexit represented a step change in the sense that the EU began to understand collectively that it had to garner resources and capacity, and it had to mobilize those resources, but also learn to use them in a highly complex vertical and horizontal system. So there has been learning, if that's the theoretical frame you want to use, because if you look, if I look at how the institutions responded to Brexit, then the pandemic, and then Ukraine, there's an extraordinary degree of interaction and interconnection between the Commission and the Council and the European Council now. And you say the EU, it took a long time to respond to the pandemic. Well, I think if we judge that response in terms of the Eurozone crisis, then I think it was very fast. I mean, all you had was March 2020, when it looked as if the member states would, some member states were introducing limits on exports. You had, everyone was worried about their ICU capacity, their bed capacity, etc., etc. But the speed with which they shifted on vaccines and also on the RRF was remarkable. I mean, I think we shouldn't underestimate what agreement on the RRF represented. And I would argue again that that would not have been possible if the UK was a member state. In other words, the Frugal Four were simply not strong enough. Now, they negotiated their way to an acceptable outcome, but they couldn't veto it. And again, one of the interesting things about the pandemic in institutional terms is the intensity of heads of government exchange and intervention in debates in other countries. I mean, they were all out, all battling for airspace. And the European Council, if we go back to July 2020, that was the second longest European Council in the history of the EU. So I do think we're looking at the EU, we've experienced what a step change. And for example, if you think about the failing forward theorizing about the EU, I just don't buy that. If you're always going forward, then it can't all be failure. And so the failing forward, I think what we need to rebalance in the literature is not to underestimate the faces, but I think a lot of the literature tends towards pessimism and weakness and is not seeing the resilience and the robustness. And it's not that I want to argue that the EU faces a rosy future, it's just politics, and politics is tough. And political systems, including the United States, are under severe strain just now. But so I do think there's a tendency in the literature to think that the distinctiveness of the EU robs it of some of the characteristics of polities that we should be familiar with.
So we have a couple of questions in the chat from Eduardo Vache and Brian Baboon. I'm going to give them the opportunity if they want to ask the questions live. Before I do that, maybe just to ask you one point that follows on from your exchange with Teresa, and particularly we talked about the speed of the response to COVID relative to the euro crisis, and of course the third installment of the story is the response to the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. And I wonder if you want to say anything about how that fits. And it does seem to be a kind of sequence. Brexit, COVID, Ukraine, and this is a different sequence from Euro crisis, migration, refugee crisis, and looks much more like what I like to call succeeding forward rather than failing forward. But just reflect a little bit on that, and then I will give the floor to Eduardo and to Brian and others who in the audience would like to ask their questions live.
So should I respond on Ukraine?
Yeah, why don't you do that?
Okay.
Just
so again, I think Ukraine, if the European Council on Ukraine happened the evening of the 24th of February. I think Ukraine, so most of the issues around Ukraine, so-called strategic autonomy, energy reliance, and the role of the EU in defense and security have been around for a very long time. But the urgency.
Speak a little louder because the camera's not turning to you.
Okay,
so why?
In terms of Ukraine, the issues that Ukraine raises in terms of energy dependence and also defense and security have been around for a very long time on the EU agenda. They're not new. But of course, what is new is urgency. And the urgency is because war has returned to the continent. But in my view, it's also because of Ukrainian agency. I think had Ukraine not managed to survive the initial invasion, there would be sanctions. The capitals, particularly in the western half of the continent, would wring their hands and say, oh, poor Ukraine. Ukraine has driven the Ukrainian issue onto, and they've done it because they've survived and they've been willing to fight. And so I think Ukraine is almost different again to those other two, the pandemic and the Brexit, because it really is hard geopolitics. And it's moving the EU to confront the fact that the world is not as Europe would wish. The continent isn't even any longer as Europe would wish. And so the EU has to become, is compelled in my view to become, a more rounded geopolitical actor in the next phase. But that's really tough stuff for the EU.
Okay, so I'm going to give the floor now to Eduardo Laffan. Eduardo, can you unmute first of all, and then briefly identify yourself and then ask the question.
Yes, hello, I'm Eduardo. I am a student, a master's student in European politics and external relations. So I would like to thank, first of all, Professor Laffan for the presentation, and Teresa and Professor Zetlin for organizing the event. My question is with regards to how we should approach the study of Brexit. I'm doing my thesis on Brexit and what it means for the sovereignty of the United Kingdom. And I've came across a lot of papers, and they were focusing on Brexit as an expression, as a phenomenon of European disintegration. Now, as you said, it's not the EU has not disintegrated as of now. So shouldn't we look at it as an example of disintegration from the European Union, which means shifting the focus from the EU as a polity to the member states, so to the constitutive units of the EU? Thank you. I don't know if that was clear.
So I don't think so. And why do I say that? Because you can't theorize the EU just in terms of its constitutive units, because there is a duality in the nature of the EU. It has, and that duality is a union of states, but also a union of peoples. And so the EU is not a scaled up version of its member states. The whole is more than the parts. So I think in studying Brexit, you've got to also, there are so many different lenses you can adopt. You can certainly look at Brexit from the preferences of individual member states, but I think if you want to understand the EU and Brexit, then you must retain a collective perspective. And looking at the constituent parts won't take you very far. If, on the other hand, you're looking at Brexit from the perspective of the United Kingdom, then that's a very different, because the United Kingdom is the country that left. And in my view, particularly Johnson and David Frost, the driving force of the negotiation of the TCA was a sovereignty first Brexit, but an extraordinary interpretation of what sovereignty means in the 21st century, because it's almost, they wanted this purest form of 19th century sovereignty that never in fact existed in reality. And it's also, I think there's a great irony that that part of Europe whose sovereignty has never really been that threatened, the United Kingdom, is the one that went into this sort of breakdown about the meaning of sovereignty in the 21st century. And so I find a lot of the debate, that the Frost-Johnson debate on Brexit, I find it very ideological. And I think David Frost was a zealot. That's a personal view.
Okay, we have quite a few other questions. Our audience is remote but active. So Brian Berboon, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, perfect.
Yes? Okay, good. Well, I also want to thank you for, Professor Laffan, for the really terrific presentation. And as I wrote in my comment, it's really a postmortem of sorts that I think is very useful. And I want to ask a question, sort of two parts of the question that really is really about trying to be a devil's advocate to the view that infuses the argument you made, the view that the way the EU managed the Brexit can be seen in that postmortem, in a sense, can be seen as capable and competent. It has the various components that you articulated. So I'm convinced about the procedural characteristics, the governance characteristics that, in a sense, undergirded the response. The framing and so on. But it seems to me that the presumption that it was, a good shepherding or navigating, whatever your metaphor is, of this really difficult situation, of this crisis, doesn't take seriously a couple of sort of reasons why I think it's too early to judge how good the EU was how competent it was in its navigation. And that's because partly we don't know how the interests are really going to play out. And I do believe that certainly the economic side of the interests are so key to the long-term judgments. So it seems to me that it's still possible that in a year's time we're going to see a series of decisions, political economic decisions on the part of the UK, which will make Brexit look attractive to a lot of people within the EU member states, the EU 27 member states, and be sort of construed as a success, in which case there's going to be a wonder, well, why didn't the framing and the negotiation process more generally deal with those changes? And I'm thinking here of economic interests of the UK in the direction of basically poaching everything economically from what the EU tries to build. So undermining economic policies, taking advantage of the higher standards that the EU sets by pursuing a sort of low standard regulation road. So basically a lefty concern about the future of the UK could be a problem for the EU, and it has implications for your argument, because it's striking to me that the EU didn't actually spend that much time trying to cover off all these vulnerabilities. And then the second related part is about sovereignty that you just referred to, I think, quite well. So you partly answered the question, but also for the long-term effect of Brexit, it's important to know whether democratic sovereignty is construed as improved and reasonable within the EU context, or whether the step of exiting the EU is the only way to protect the broad notions of sort of moving target notions of democratic sovereignty. And again, there I actually think what you just said about sovereignty was more than what most of the framing by the EU has been on democratic sovereignty. So there's still big democratic deficit issues. So until those issues get dealt with, we won't really know if people look back at the EU navigation of the crisis as being so sovereign, so strong and effective. So that's my question. Is it too early to make that judgment, given that the economic interests are not yet completely clear in longish term, and that the democratic sovereignty issues are not yet clear? Thank you.
So firstly, let me begin with the democratic sovereignty. So the United Kingdom has become a less, not more democratic system since it left the EU. Its government has prorogued Parliament, which the UK Supreme Court found to be illegal. If you have a majority in the House of Commons in the United Kingdom, and certainly a sizable one, the checks and balances in that political system are extremely weak. And effectively, if you're Scottish today, you've been taken out of the EU against your will. So I simply don't buy the argument that also, in order to deal with the legal consequences of Brexit, the United Kingdom has resorted to some prerogatives that began under Henry VIII. Now, if you tell me that's democracy in the 21st century, I simply don't buy it. I think it has strengthened executive government in the United Kingdom in the context of a Johnson government with 80-seat majority. And the checks and balances of being a member state in the EU are slightly stronger, albeit I accept that there is a very serious rule of law issue in relation to Hungary and Poland in the United Kingdom. So the idea that somehow or other that the United Kingdom is a more democratic state today than it was on the they left in 31st January 2021. Anyway, I just don't buy the argument. On the EU and democratic sovereignty and the nature of the EU as a democracy or as a polity, I think one has to establish the benchmarks against which you're judging the EU. So if I look at the international system and look at politics beyond the state, transnationalism, then the EU is much more democratic than any other transnational institution that exists, and it's the only one with a parliament. That doesn't mean that I don't think there could be more and stronger engagement. I think there's been an interesting experiment with citizens panels in the Conference on the Future of Europe. So I think there's a lot of democratic experimentation going on in the EU. But again, if the standard you set is that of a domestic democracy, then the EU will always be more attenuated because of scale and thinner because it doesn't need to be thicker. That doesn't mean that you won't see a strengthening of democracy, because you have seen it over the last 20 to 30 years. Now, on to the interests and how they play out. I think that the EU's single market dwarfs anything that the United Kingdom can ever represent. So the structural imbalance of economic power between the two is very significant. That doesn't mean that the UK won't, in some areas, through regulation, manage to get an advantage. But I guarantee you, whenever they do, the EU will take a very serious look, and they won't have the advantage for very long. And the economic response to Brexit in the United Kingdom is the trade. What's happening is small producers in the United Kingdom are being absolutely hammered. They're simply exiting the single market because they can't meet. And of course, any UK-based company that wants to sell into the EU market has got to meet the standards of the EU anyway, or its products will simply not be sold on the European market. So I think the idea of poaching is, the free ports was one great idea. Again, no evidence that they will work. So I think that there is I think that it is it's a big gamble for any country to create very serious barriers to economic exchange with its nearest neighbors. It does matter in economic exchange. That doesn't mean that Brexit is a disaster for the UK economy. The UK would simply grow less and will be poorer as a result. But that doesn't mean it's a disaster. But again, one has to ask, why did they do it? And again, just simply speaking, in terms of my own country, Ireland, the assumption was in London that the Irish economy could not survive Brexit. All you have to do is look at the shipping routes direct from Dublin and the East Coast and Cork straight to the continent now. So those producers in Ireland that had to get product to market quickly, they simply bypassed the United Kingdom. And Holyhead, that voted for Brexit, there have been serious job losses in Holyhead because the Irish trade has opted for different routes. So I get your argument that it's too early to tell, but you know what? We're still waiting for communism to work as well.
Okay, we have 3 more questions. I'm going to read them out, and then you can.
You see, my problem is I can't read because I
No,
don't
no,
have
no.
my glasses.
I will read
So
them for you.
I can't see anything.
No, don't worry. If you want, you can come up here and look at them yourself.
No, just.
Okay, so the first is from our colleague Anke Jurgens, who teaches in the History of European Studies department, is a specialist on Germany, and also works at the Germany Institute, the Duitsland Institute, Amsterdam. He thanks you for the highly interesting talk. They ask, do you agree with me that the role of the member states is somewhat larger than expected, particularly the role of Macron and Merkel is generally underestimated? They were able to come up with a coordinated response as well, and to give all the credits to Barnier. However, they were not able to come up with more fundamental proposals for reform due to the pressure of Brexit as well as Trump. So that's the first question. Second is from Waltraud Schelke, who I guess is still at the LSE, but is moving to the EUI. And she thanks you as well. She says, I've heard you talk about Brexit before. Each time I learn something new. I'm curious how you see the interplay between the task force and the council members. Was there real steering by member states, or was it a fairly autonomous task force that merely reported back but led the negotiations as it saw fit? In other words, was this an outcome of the polity acting or of technocracy at its most effective? And then finally, we have a question from a student from our politics, psychology, law, and economics program, who's Federica Antonioni. And Federica asked, do you think the EU would be just as prepared if a Brexit domino was to happen? I do think the EU has been able to transform the Brexit crisis in favor of its integration process, especially given all the challenges the UK has faced that you brought up in your answer to Brian. And I think that's the end of our questions, so I'll let you answer these questions.
So thank you for the questions, and thank everyone for very interesting questions. On the role of Merkel and Macron, absolutely. I mean, so the supranational institutions played an extremely important role, but the commandship on Brexit was the European Council. And within that, the Sherpas were working very closely together. And of course, Merkel and Macron's Sherpas worked very intensively, did work very intensively together. So I don't think that the member states played a larger role than expected. The member states would have to, and particularly the dominant, the larger ones. Now, interestingly, on the pandemic, I think Rome was extremely important as well, and also on Ukraine. But Rome was not that significant in Brexit. Certainly Berlin and Paris were. Waltraud, on the task force, was it technocracy or politics? It was both, because so the Council task force was extremely interesting. They decided very early on that it would be chaired by a permanent person and someone from the institutions and not from the capital. Secondly, the Council task force only had officials from the Council Secretariat, and they refused any offers of secondment from the member states. But Didier Salvos, who chaired that, he had a Brexit person in each permanent representation, but those were then also feeding into Coreper, into the GAP, and into the European Council. So it was both and. It was both the political layer and the technocratic layer. What the technocratic layer did was it ensured that the issues were well worked. In other words, that there was a very careful assessment of the consequences of Brexit for the EU, technically, but then political lessons and political conclusions were drawn from that. So I don't think the negotiation of Brexit was a technocratic exercise. It was strategic in my view, and both technocracy and politics fed into that strategic response. On the domino, of course, particularly in the shock phase of Brexit, the absolute priority was to ensure no domino, because you could survive the departure of one member state, but certainly perhaps not two. But also, Brexit, it became very clear, it became a living experiment in the problems a country faces if they try to disentangle themselves from deep interdependence. And it was a living, I mean, people, buying stuff from the UK now see the problems, etc., etc. So it was something very visible. And I think it did strengthen the integration. It didn't weaken the EU, it strengthened it. That's not to say that the actors on the EU side wanted this to happen or didn't experience deep regret at the departure of the United Kingdom. Now, for me, the one policy area or policy instrument that, in my view, could never have been achieved with UK membership is the RRF. And so maybe the calculus is shifting now to a conclusion that maybe the EU also benefits in some measure from Brexit. But that's, I think that's a much more open question. Of course, now with Ukraine, what we see is that the UK wants to do everything on the defence NATO side, because obviously it doesn't have a seat at the EU table. But for the EU, military clearance of the lethal weapons to Ukraine are all happening not through NATO, because NATO doesn't want to do it, but it's happening through the military structures of the EU. And I think that's a very interesting development and could well be a game changer. But it's very new, and so I wouldn't rush to any conclusions. And of course, my expectation would be on the UK-EU relationship that post a Johnson era, whenever that happens in the United Kingdom, we will see an effort both on the EU side and the UK side to strengthen neighbourly relations between, because the level of interdependence remains high, but also the EU is not some abstract set of institutions in Brussels. It really is the UK's neighbours, and it's not long-term in the UK's interests to have to weaken its relations. And I know that a lot of emphasis is now put on the bilateral relationship that the UK has with different member states, but that never, ever, ever will compensate for the seat at the table.
Thanks, Brigid. Wonderful lecture. It's a great moment to go out on. For those of you whose appetite to hear Brigid's ideas has only been whetted and not satiated, you can probably still register remotely for her lecture at the Asser Institute tomorrow. There she will talk about more the geopolitical dimensions of collective power in Europe. But now I just want to thank you, Brigid, and I hope eventually we will go back to actually having events in person. This is like a kind of phony war stage in which we're trying to have hybrid events, but we're not quite there. Okay, thanks. to everybody. I'll end this now. I hope to see many of you in person, or if not, at least online, other ACES events in the future.